My name is Abby Harrington. I am 28 years old. For 20 years, my parents called me the slow one, while my sister Victoria collected Stanford degrees and inheritance promises. They mocked my auditory processing disorder at dinner tables, excluded me from family decisions, and paid me a fraction of what they paid her. But on Victoria's graduation day, at the Ritz-Carlton, in front of 350 guests, a stranger handed me an envelope that would expose every lie my parents ever told about me. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't cry when my father, William, stood on that stage and handed the keys to the empire to Victoria. I didn't ask why my name wasn't mentioned in the inheritance of a $25 million estate. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet that had finally been balanced. I sat there in my simple dress, feeling the vibration of the music I couldn't quite process, and realized my family affection had been a subscription I'd been footing the bill for. My compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. For 2 years, I had worked as an administrative assistant at Harrington Tech. My salary was $50,000 a year. Victoria's was $500,000. I spent my days in the server room, my humming sanctuary. To my parents, the server room was a basement for the unfit, a place to hide the daughter who couldn't keep up with the fast-paced chatter of boardrooms. But to me, it was the only place that made sense. The servers didn't judge my processing speed. They just ran on logic and patterns. It's a strange thing to be a ghost in your own family's success story. I watched my father and Victoria through the glass walls of the executive suite, realizing they had entered the trap of cruel normalization. They had spent so long treating my exclusion as a standard business practice that they didn't even realize they were being monstrous. To them, my auditory processing disorder was a liability to be managed, not a person to be loved. They had normalized the idea that if you aren't the loudest voice in the room, you don't exist. They weren't shocked by what they were doing to me. They were just comfortable with it. I stood by the service entrance of the ballroom, looking at the scuffed screen of my phone. It was a perfect metaphor for my life shattered, yet still functioning, still collecting data. While they were celebrating Victoria's miracle algorithm, I was running my own diagnostic. I wasn't just the girl who fetched coffee. I was the silent investor in their version of family, and I was about to pull my funding. I looked at the heavy cream envelope in my hand. Jonathan Ellis had vanished into the crowd, but his words stayed. He told me it was time to show them who I really am. I wasn't a glitch in their system. I was the architect of its collapse. My auditory processing disorder was never a wall. It was a filter. My parents and Victoria saw it as a glitch in my hardware, a reason to speak over me or leave me out of the conversation entirely. But while they lived in a world of constant, shallow chatter, I lived in a world of structures. In the silence of my processing, I didn't just hear words. I saw the architecture behind them. I saw the logic gaps in my father's business strategies and the catastrophic bugs in Victoria's groundbreaking code. For years, I was the invisible hand that kept Harrington Tech from collapsing under its own arrogance. Every time Victoria bragged about her new miracle artificial intelligence module at dinner, I was the one who had spent my night in the server room, quietly patching the logic holes she was too brilliant to notice. I didn't do it because I loved her. I did it because the system had to be correct. I was the silent maintenance crew for a dynasty that didn't even know its foundation was rotting. People often ask why I stayed as a $50,000 assistant for 2 years, why I didn't just walk away from a family that treated me like an embarrassing secret. They don't understand the survivor's invisible chain. It is a mental state where silence isn't a choice, it is a tactical position. I was like a prisoner who had found the keys to the cell but stayed inside to map out the entire guard rotation. I wasn't just fetching coffee. I was documenting every failure of my father's leadership and every stolen piece of intellectual property Victoria claimed as her own. Grandma Margaret was the only one who saw the architect behind my silence. Every Sunday afternoon, I would take the train to her apartment. She didn't read me stories, she showed me old company contracts. She taught me that everything is a system, the company, the family, and even the law. Abby, she would tell me, her voice steady and sharp, don't read the words, read the architecture. See how the pieces connect. She was training me for a war that hadn't started yet. That Sunday in 2019, she handed me the engraved silver tablet case. She told me I read slower than most, but I saw things others missed. That wasn't a disability, it was a different kind of vision. I didn't open the case then. I tucked it into the back of my closet, letting it sit in the dark while I continued my role as the family ghost. I was waiting for the one moment where my silence would become the most powerful sound in the room. And as I stood at the Ritz-Carlton watching Victoria's coronation, I knew the wait was over. The grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton felt like it was losing oxygen. My mother, Kimberly, cornered me near the heavy velvet curtains, her face a mask of practiced concern. It was the expression she used when one of her gala centerpieces arrived slightly wilted. Victoria stood beside her emerald Valentino dress shimmering with a light my $50,000 a year salary would never see. Kimberly handed me a physical copy of the email I'd received earlier. Position restructuring, it said in bold, clinical font. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my drugstore makeup and my scuffed heels. Abigail, she began, her voice like ice water. We've made a decision. It's for the sake of organizational optimization. Victoria stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume filling the small space between us. We can't have the CEO's sister fetching coffee while I take the company public. Abby, it looks like a glitch in the software. It invites questions we don't want to answer. She wasn't just firing me. She was attempting to delete me from the Harrington Tech source code. Kimberly mentioned the severance retreat, a 6-month stay at a specialized facility in the Swiss Alps to handle my condition. They called it a luxury. I called it a digital exile. They wanted to hide the slow one while they sold the lie of their genius to the highest bidder. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for my job or tell them that $1,800 a month for a shared room in Queens would become an impossible math problem without that check. I just looked at the silver tablet case tucked under my arm. Victoria mocked it, pointing at the small dent in the corner. Still carrying that junk around? Maybe you can use your severance to buy a life that isn't a cracked screen, Abby. She laughed, and Kimberly joined in, a soft, musical sound that had been the background noise of my childhood neglect. They were comfortable in their cruelty because it had been normalized for over 20 years. To them, I was a bug to be patched, a legacy error that needed to be overwritten. Kimberly patted my shoulder with her manicured hand. Don't be dramatic, honey. It's just business. You were always a phase in this family, not the future. I watched them walk back toward the stage, their silhouettes blending into the sea of Silicon Valley elite. My anger wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was a cold, clinical reboot. I looked down at the cream envelope from Jonathan Ellis. I didn't need their permission to exist anymore. I had the keys to the entire server, and I was about to change every password. I didn't wait for the dessert service or the final self-congratulatory toasts to end. I pushed through the heavy service doors, the sound of the violin quartet fading into a dull, rhythmic hum as the kitchen staff scurried past me with silver trays. I found an empty utilitarian stairwell near the loading dock, the air smelling of cold concrete and industrial floor wax. My hands were perfectly steady as I broke the red wax seal on the heavy cream envelope. Inside were 3 pages of dense legal text that my father, William, would have spent months trying to find a loophole in. But I didn't read the words. I read the architecture of the system. To my granddaughter, Abigail Harrington, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Harrington Tech Limited Liability Company, along with all associated voting rights. I read the sentence once, then twice, letting the reality settle into my lungs. It wasn't just a gift, it was a mandate. My grandmother, Margaret, had seen through my father's boardroom theater years before she passed. She had known that William Harrington would eventually mistake my auditory processing disorder for a lack of character. In the will, She stated clearly that I had been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not due to a lack of ability, but due to a lack of support. She wrote that I was not slow, I was abandoned by a father who confused credentials with worth. Jonathan Ellis appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his leather soles echoing sharply on the concrete steps. He checked his watch with a clinical precision that matched my own mood. "You found the clause," he said quietly. "It was 8:30 p.m. on May 15th. You have exactly 72 hours, Abby. If you do not formally request an emergency board meeting within this window, the shares revert to your father under the terms of the 2015 testament. This document becomes null and void." The deadline wasn't a threat, it was a strategically timed release. I looked at him, the flickering fluorescent light overhead casting long shadows between us. "Why did she wait?" I asked. Jonathan's expression shifted, revealing the silent regret of the watchman. He told me that Margaret had spent the last 3 years of her life in a state of internal struggle, caught between her hope that her son would change and the devastating reality of the daughter he was attempting to erase. She had stayed silent not because she agreed with my father, but because she knew that if she handed me power before I was ready, I wouldn't have the steel to protect it. She waited until the pressure of his cruelty was high enough to forge me into the leader the company actually needed. I didn't need 72 hours to make a decision. I had spent 20 years in the shadow of their genius, quietly mapping the logic gaps in their legacy. The sensible, quiet daughter was a tactical role I was finished playing. I looked at the digital clock on my phone, the numbers ticking forward with lethal clarity. "Request the meeting, Jonathan," I said, my voice sounding like the cold reboot of a system. "Set it for 10 a.m. on May 18th, Harrington Tower, 42nd floor. I'm through being a ghost in this machine. It's time to change the source code." The silver tablet case felt cold against my skin, like a block of ice I had been carrying in my lungs for 5 years. I sat on my bed, the only light in my cramped apartment coming from the blue glow of my laptop. Jonathan Ellis stood by the window, a silent guardian in the shadows. We had 72 hours to reboot a dynasty, and the key was finally in my hands. I entered the passcode my birthday, the one my parents always forgot, but Margaret never did. The latch clicked open with a sound like a single, final heartbeat. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a single, high-encryption USB drive and a folder of notarized documents. I plugged it in. My fingers did not tremble. I had moved past fear into a state of clinical precision. As the files loaded, I saw the architecture of my own mind reflected back at me. It was Aegis, the autonomous artificial intelligence system that had made Victoria the darling of Silicon Valley. But these were not Victoria's files. They were mine. The visual flowcharts, the nonlinear logic gates, the specific neural mapping I had developed in the server room to handle my own sensory overload, it was all there. Margaret had not just listened to me during those Sunday afternoons. She had notarized my diagrams and filed for blind patents in my name, years before she died. Every miracle Victoria claimed to have authored was a direct theft of my uncredited labor. William Harrington had not just sidelined me. He had harvested my intellectual property and rebranded it to build his genius daughter's brand. It was corporate espionage disguised as family hierarchy. It was patent fraud totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. I sat back, the blue light of the screen washing over me. I could not help but wonder about the world without Margaret. In that version of reality, William's termination protocol would have worked perfectly. I would have been sent to that Swiss retreat, effectively erased, while they sold my brain for a massive merger profit. Without Margaret's quiet vigilance, my entire life would have been a legacy of theft. I would have lived and died believing I was a glitch, never realizing I was the source code. My father had not just been a cruel parent, he had been a criminal. Stealing from a daughter he claimed was too slow to understand the value of what she held. "It is not just a will anymore, is it?" I asked, my voice sounding like the cold hum of a server under full load. Jonathan did not turn from the window. "No, Abby, it is an indictment." I looked at the stacks of evidence. This was not a family feud. It was a hostile takeover of the truth. I closed the silver case and stood up. The silence in the room was absolute. I was not just going to that board meeting to claim my shares. I was going there to delete the people who had tried to overwrite me. I had the truth, notarized and encrypted. And in 48 hours, I was going to force a system reboot that they would never recover from. Harrington Tower looked like a tomb of glass and steel as I stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor. The air was sterile, filtered through expensive systems that didn't care about my auditory processing disorder. William and Victoria were already there, surrounded by the 12 board members, celebrating the miracle merger that my brain had actually authored. My father looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from surprise to that familiar, deep-seated dismissal. "Abby," he said, not even bothering to stand, "this isn't the server room. You were fired yesterday. Security is on their way." Victoria smirked, leaning back in her leather chair. Still holding on to that dented tablet case? "It's over, Abby. Organizational optimization doesn't have a place for legacies like you." I didn't answer them. I didn't get worked up or cause the scene they were so afraid of. I just looked at Jonathan Ellis. He stepped forward with a precision that was lethal in its quietness. He laid the notarized copies of Margaret's 2019 will on the mahogany table. "Actually, William," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a surgical blade, "Miss Harrington is here as the majority shareholder. Under the terms of Margaret Harrington's final testament, she holds 51% of all voting shares in Harrington Tech." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a digital vacuum. I watched my father's face drain of color, turning the gray of unpowered hardware. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I have her will from 2015. Jonathan didn't blink. This one is dated 4 years later. It is notarized, witnessed, and ironclad. As of this moment, you are an employee reporting to your daughter." Victoria's composure shattered. She stood up, her hand hitting the table. "This is a scam. She's too slow to even understand a dividend, let alone run a $185 million company." I plugged the tablet from the silver case into the boardroom's main display. "I'm not here to run the company today," I said, my voice clinical and factual. "I'm here to correct the ledger." I bypassed their encryption in seconds. On the massive screens, I displayed the Aegis source code side by side with my visual notes from 3 years ago. I showed the board the notarized timestamps. I showed the patent fraud. I watched the board members, people William thought he owned, lean forward, their loyalty shifting as they realized their genius CEO was just a common thief. As my father began to beg, talking about his legacy and his authority, I realized he was suffering from the illusion of power from an empty wallet. He believed his position was part of his personality, something he was rather than something he merely had. He didn't understand that his authority was a facade rented with his mother's money and my labor. Now that the money was gone, he was just a hollow shell with a title he hadn't earned. He was fragile because he had no internal value, only the external status of his bank account. "I'm calling for a vote," I said, looking directly at the chairman. A motion of no confidence in William Harrington as CEO. The silence returned, heavy and judging. One by one, the hands went up. 7, 8, 10. William sat there, watching his kingdom dissolve into a series of raised palms. It wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The board voted no confidence, effectively stripping him of his title and ordering restitution for the misappropriated funds. I looked at the hands he thought he owned and then at the man who thought I was a glitch. "The system is rebooting, Dad," I said, "and you're no longer authorized to log in." The fallout was swift and binary. William Harrington signed his formal resignation on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 28 days after the board's vote. He didn't look at me as he left Harrington Tower for the last time. His departure wasn't a tragedy. It was a necessary system update. Victoria's fraudulent patents were voided by the end of the month, her name stripped from the very records she had claimed as her own. She was blacklisted from every major tech firm in Silicon Valley, her reputation as a prodigy revealed to be nothing more than a legacy of theft. They lost the mansion, the status, and the illusion of their own brilliance. I didn't take the CEO seat. I didn't want the noise of the boardroom or the shallow chatter of executive luncheons. I appointed a professional board and took the title I had earned years ago, Chief Visionary Officer. I stayed in the architecture of the company, designing systems that prioritize ethics over exploitation. My auditory processing disorder is no longer a liability I hide. It is the core of my strategic vision. I realize now that my disorder wasn't my flaw. It was the very thing that allowed me to see the patterns everyone else missed. I finally feel at home in my own skin, having built a future on my own terms. This is the justice of the seed sower. I didn't just want to punish my father for the past. I wanted to build a future where the next slow one wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen. I used the recovered dividends to found the Margaret Harrington Foundation for Neurodivergent Innovators. We provide grants, mentorship, and legal protection for those who see the world differently. I am not focused on destroying what my father was. I am busy planting the seeds for what the world can become. I want to speak directly to you now, the one watching this, who has always felt like the invisible one, the glitch in your family's perfect software. I know the ache of not belonging and the exhaustion of trying to prove your worth to people who have already decided you are zero. But you are not a mistake to be corrected. You are an architect whose vision is simply too complex for their narrow minds to process. Stop waiting for them to give you a seat at the table. You don't need an invitation to be luminous. You just need to give yourself permission to shine. If this story reminded you that your worth isn't determined by the people who failed to see it, subscribe and join our community. Leave a comment and tell me your story. Your narrative belongs to you, and nobody can ever take that away.